evening, everyone. Welcome to Strider's professional webinar series focusing on equine media and success in communications. I'm Tara Sperzi. I'm the CEO of Strider. Thrilled to have you all here tonight. We're going to be talking about success in equestrian media and communications, but really focusing on a couple of areas that are near and dear to the panelists' hearts. How people consume information, how as a equine media person you can do it successfully, the accountability in the communication, and the education theme in communication that runs through all of these professionals' careers, both in the past and present. So tonight we've got an all-star lineup. Some of you have already looked at their bios online from experts across the industry. So I'll give you a quick overview of them, and then they're going to give you a little insight into them, and we'll kick off the discussion. From the United States Eventing Association, which is an association near and dear to my heart as an eventer, we have Leslie Mintz, who is an award-winning editor, a writer, a graphic designer, a photographer. She's got over a decade of experience in the media and communication fields. She's got a very unique perspective in the industry because she has to walk the tightrope between the various stakeholders in the sport as well as the governing bodies. She does it brilliantly. We're delighted to have her here tonight to share her insights. From Noelle Floyd, we have Carolyn Culbertson, the editor-in-chief, Noelle Floyd. She is the host and producer of Equestrian Voices podcast, but she is also part of the creative brilliance and the driver behind the Noelle Floyd Masterclass series. If you've not seen those videos on Noelle Floyd, walk quickly and sign up to it, or even run. We won't tell anybody. There is very little about appearing on camera, radio, and podcasts that Carolyn does not know about. So if you're looking for insights in how to be successful in those types of communications, she's a great resource to listen to. She's passionate about connecting people to one another and to their communities. So thank you, Carolyn, for joining us this evening. And last but not least, we have Piper Klemm, who is the owner and the publisher of the Plaid horse. She is on a personal mission to educate young equestrians about every facet of the industry and to empower young women, especially, to find their voice in their stories. She spent her entire professional career in education through various channels, whether it's as the Plaidcast, the North American's most listened to horse show podcast, as an author, or as a professor. She's got a very unique background with a PhD in chemistry that we're going to hear about in a short while. So Piper, thank you so much for joining us as well this evening. So with that, without further ado, let's get into the discussion. We're going to start off with the panelists sharing a little bit about themselves. Leslie, I know you have a journalism background. Can you share a little bit about how you traveled from where you were at into equestrian media and what drew you into this space that you've made your career in?
Of course. So yes, as you said, I majored in journalism from the University of Georgia, go Dogs. And I was an eventer, and I've been riding my whole life. And what more could you want than combining your passion with your education and career? So 4 days after I graduated college, I packed up my Jeep and drove up to Virginia for a 6-month internship at the USDA. And here we are over 10 years later. So it's definitely been a journey. I started, as an intern. I went through the organization as a lot of different roles as I sort of waited for the right opening. And then when I was able to take over as editor of the Eventing USA magazine, that was kind of my dream role within the organization, because that finally, combined my journalism love and the eventing. So I took over as editor in 2015. And also am the director of media, managing the website, social media, overseeing all the voice for the association. So it's, definitely the love of horses that brought me to the job. And it's just, a dream to be able to combine it all.
You've got a lot of balls that you're juggling in the air. So hats off to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's we're a really small organization. We only have 15 people on staff, but we have a reach of over 100,000, and so you have to everybody wears a lot of hats and gets it done. It's eventers.
There you go. All right. Piper, you've got an interesting journey as well. Can you share a little bit with the audience how you got into becoming editor of the Plaid horse and publisher?
Absolutely. I rode growing up, and I come from a non-horse family. My mom opened the phone book and found a barn for me. And so I think we made a lot of the mistakes that people make trying to get into the industry, like literally knowing nothing. And I kind of hit some walls, as I think is pretty common, and couldn't figure out my own pathway, and couldn't see how I could get what I wanted done in the horse thing. And I went to college and I didn't ride, and I really focused on school. And I was very successful at school because I think all the skills we learn at the barn really translate really well. I went to Trinity College in Connecticut and have a liberal arts education, which I'm a firm believer in, studying all kinds of things and learning how to learn and learning how you learn, because you can apply that to anything down the road. I was really good at chemistry. I went to Berkeley to get my PhD. I got my PhD when I was 24. I got a little lost on the, just because you're good at it, other people push you, other people expect you to do things and other people push you. And I got going pretty hard down that pathway, and I was able to have good people around me. And I said, I'm not enjoying what I'm doing on a daily basis, even though I am good at it. And I think that's a struggle that a lot of people, have. And so it kind of forced me to take a step and look at where I wanted to be. And I wanted to be back in the horse world. And it all essentially happened by accident. My treat to myself for finishing my PhD was I went to Thermal for the whole circuit. And I wasn't riding or showing or anything. I just was going to go, and I don't know what I was thinking. I was just going to go watch. I just wanted to go. I was going so hard. And so about a week in, I had never really lived on the West Coast or ridden there. So I had no friends. And about a weekend, I was super bored. And on Facebook, someone posted we had someone back out at the last minute. Can you cover the Grand Prix on Saturday? Is anyone at Thermal and not doing anything and could cover the Grand Prix on Saturday night? And I was I've never done anything like that in my life. And I was like, oh, I can do that. I don't know. And I just showed up.
Coincidence and fate that brings you into the media then.
Yep. And I showed up and I did it. And it was a complete light bulb moment for me from an educational perspective, because my whole life I had a million questions and everyone told me to shut up. And then when you come up to someone as a media, they want to talk to you. They want to tell you about how their horse went. They want to explain things to you. And I was like, this is such a missing educational piece. And so from there, everything just evolved. And I realized I, needed to make my own decisions about where things were going to go. And I started to try to figure out a position where I could make my own decisions.
Fair enough. So you found it by luck, but then you made a path on it on intention.
Yep.
Okay. Carolyn, you've got a pretty diverse background as well. And I know you've got a lot of different areas. What brought you into the media area in the equestrian space?
Yeah. So, like Leslie, I'd ridden my entire life. I grew up with parents who were very supportive, but didn't know anything about horses. Well, my mom she has some old pictures of her in Texas, riding a little cow pony. So the support definitely was there kind of emotionally, but we couldn't necessarily afford for me to be a horse show kid or anything like that. So we actually bought a tiny little barn in North Carolina, kind of built up over time, and ended up again, because we couldn't afford to buy our horses, we bred them. So that was kind of, I remember in high school, driving home from, I think I was headed to school, and I remember I turned around and drove home because my mom was like, the mare is foaling, you should come back. And so I remember kicking my shoes off and running into the stall, of course, an idiot 15-year-old, a horse does not want you to run into their stall when they're giving birth. But that, so there was, my entire family was really interested in it. My sister became a large animal veterinarian. She still is a great veterinarian in North Carolina. And then I went to, as much as I said I always wanted to be really far away to go to college, I ended up going 30 minutes down the road to Duke University, where I studied English and environmental science and policy. And then after college, I actually rode in a working student position for a year, which was I still think of that year as kind of the most challenging and foundational year probably of my life. Any working student will tell you probably the same thing. It's a growth that is hard to even explain to someone who hasn't, isn't familiar with the horse world. And then I interned at the Chronicle of the Horse. I had interned during college at a newspaper in New York through a program that I did through NYU. And so I had some, even though my degree was not journalism, I had some sort of journalistic experience. And then after that year of being a working student, like Leslie, I applied for a job at the USEA. It was like a little communications assistant position, and then just kind of worked my way up there to run a lot of their web content. And then it's so funny to reflect on this like winding journey. I think probably Piper and Leslie will say the same thing. You kind of look back and you're like, oh, it's so coincidental, the people that you meet that open these doors and all of that sort of thing. It just kind of falls into place. But to make a really long story short, I mean, after the USEA, I've just stayed in horses in one capacity or another. I worked almost two full-time jobs kind of at the same time. When I was living in New Jersey, I was working for a veterinary practice there, managing their sport horse rehabilitation center. And I was also working for Heels Down Magazine. I helped them co-found their podcast and was on that podcast for about 10 or 15 episodes, and then joined the Noelle Floyd team as editor-in-chief when they were doing a big rebranding. And I've been there for about 4 years now. So that's kind of where I am now.
It's a pretty impressive journey. Sounds like all of you have had, quite the stories, quite the diverse paths to get there. So I guess that leads us into our next area that we're going to talk about, which is a little bit of some of the interviews and the stories that you've experienced and what resonates with you. And Carolyn, you just talk a little bit about like your experience with a working student and how much that resonated with you. Have you been interviewing, or did you do any spotlights either at Heels Down or a Noelle Floyd that really resonated with you, that is like your favorite interview of all times? It might be hard to kind of sift through each one and figure out which one's your favorite, but
yeah, it's I actually was thinking today that one of my favorite conversations, and truly this is not a like staged answer, but one of my favorite conversations that I've had was actually released on our podcast today. It's a roundtable with Matt Brown, Jeremy Steinberg, and Ann Krasinski. And we talk a lot about it. It was a kind of a roundtable discussion. We talk a lot about just like ethics in horse training and like, where is the line of abuse versus challenging a horse? And it was just a really amazing opportunity to bring three very different voices and perspectives together. Especially Jeremy and Matt were able to share really personal turning points in their careers. And I think as an interviewer, that is always a really special thing to bring out in somebody, is when you can really kind of get them thinking and reflecting on these major moments in their careers that they maybe hadn't even really thought through before. I remember there was also an interview that I did when I was working for Heels Down, that Oliver Townend, I was interviewing him, and he kind of said something along the lines of, oh, I've never thought, like, nobody's ever kind of gotten that out of me before. I've never thought about it that way before. And that just those moments, I think, really stand out because they're getting something out of it too, and that moment of reflection, I think. So those two moments really stand out for me.
Do you think they were successful because it was a natural conversation and they were communicating in a way that everybody who was listening to the interview could resonate with? Or do you think it was just the right time, the right place, and they just happened to feel comfortable?
I think honestly, so much of skill as an interviewer is helping people mine through their own emotions. I think that I mean, when you listen to people like Oprah do interviews, like that's really what her skill set is. It's like an empathy-based skill set. It's one that's really difficult to quantify. It's one that you can't really put on a resume. But that to me is what makes really good interviewers really great. And that's what makes those conversations feel like they've never happened before. I think we hear a lot of interviews and a lot of conversations that feel like I've heard this before in some way or another. And there's nothing wrong with that because everybody brings a little bit of their own perspective. But I think when you are really skilled in that department, which there's so many amazing interviewers out there now that you can listen to, that's what makes it feel really novel.
Yeah. The ability to have that empathy and understand that they're connecting with the person on the other side. Yeah. Oprah is just in a class by herself.
She's coming on this webinar, right?
Oh yeah. She's, if I could get her on this webinar, you would just see me at stage left, like very conveniently. So
and you get a car, and you get a car.
Yes, everybody gets a car. Everybody gets a horse. You all get horses. We're all on the horse webinar. Piper, I saw you nodding your head a lot, so it sounds like you've got a few stories in those interviews and communications too that you probably have resonated with you.
Absolutely. I think the work that we've done that I've been most proud of has been a lot of our like body image and feeling welcomed at the horse show. I think something universal is that we've all been somewhere where we felt unwelcome. And as a corollary to that, we've all felt, if only I had owned X, I wouldn't feel this way. And I think one of the most fascinating things interviewing literally everyone is that everyone feels that no one has whatever X is or is whatever X, these are lies we tell ourselves instead of developing coping mechanisms. And so I remember right in the beginning, within my first year, we put Stephanie Ray Peters on the cover and people came out of the woodwork and they're like, "You're so brave." And I was like, "What?" Like, I was so green at the time. I was like, I didn't even realize that it was brave. I was like, oh, I just thought that she rides great. And like, she's on the cover. And then in 2020, so 5 years after her first cover, both of us had grown and had a lot of conversations about all of these issues and about shame and coping mechanisms. And, we all went through and read all the Brene Brown stuff. And so we did a big cover on her again and really went into all of this, how we all have our own shame and our own issues that we bring to the horse show. And I think about how many people, like that year at Thermal, she had shipped all her horses to Thermal and she was totally open about this, which I respect so much. She essentially felt so much shame for a variety of reasons that she never showed and shipped her horses home. And I just think about all of the people that don't even participate because they're so worried about being judged. Or people say to me every day, well, like, when I lose 10 pounds, I'll start riding again, or when I, whatever. And I'm just like, no, like start now. And I think when we talk about the conversations I'm most proud of, it's whenever someone comes to me and says, like, I wasn't sure if I wanted to start riding or I was ready to start riding again. And the Plaid horse community helped me feel confident enough to try again. And, also, like, we think about this from an emotional standpoint and like what horses give me, I want everyone to feel that. So I want everyone to feel welcome at the barn. And I think all the conversations we've been having over the past few years have come back to this focal point of how do we make everyone feel welcome at the barn. But I also like look at it from a sport and an economic perspective of like, we're turning away people who want who love horses and want to ride and want to spend money on our sport, who are now not buying helmets and not buying jackets and not buying boots because like they don't feel welcome. It's so many layers of this. And so many of these businesses in our industry are women-owned businesses. And so we're shooting ourselves in the foot by, all of these perceptions of, and they're very real. I mean, people say hurtful things, people are awful. And, but the more we can have better coping mechanisms so that some random person's opinion doesn't ruin our day or ruin our, time at the barn or ruin our sport for us or make us walk away. I mean, I think that's the work we've done that's been most fulfilling to me. And I can't wait to see how that evolves to continue allowing access geographically, socioeconomically, body image, weight, status. Like, everyone should feel welcome at the barn and find their own spot in the barn community.
So it sounds like a lot of that success is the times that people emotionally feel like they're part of the community, that you've been able to facilitate that community dialogue, whether it's through the podcast or a written article or somebody featured on the front magazine, where all of a sudden other people emotionally feel like they're part of something, and that's success in the community.
Yep. And the adult amateur lounge has been a huge part of that, because they see how many, someone's like, I bet I'm the only one that's ever felt this. And then they get like, oh no, wait, you're not isolated. We're all going through this.
Great. So I know you and Leslie share a lot of similar stuff about how people consume information and the accountability going back and forth. Leslie, you've had so many different interviews, USEA, and throughout all your different realms. I'm not sure you're able to pick out one that's your favorite and why, but maybe you can.
I mean, I've definitely been very lucky to interview thousands of people over the years. And I mean, I was so nervous when I was a little kid, at calling up, these top riders, and it's gotten easier and easier. But I would say that the story that's had the biggest impact on my time as a writer was probably just in 2020, after George Floyd's death. It was a really tough decision on, do we jump on this bandwagon? We can't ignore it. I mean, it was so hard, but it really opened my eyes to saying, we need to look at our sport and our whole industry, and we need to talk about this. And, the USDA is an association. We're not, pushing the needle on anything, but I decided that it was important for us to explore our membership and figure out, how we could open the doors. So I called up Dr. Anastasia Kerwood, who's a professor at the University of Kentucky, and she was the most amazing interview and opened my eyes and educated me so much. I mean, it was really changed a lot of my, being able to then educate other people. So, and because of her interview, I asked her for allies, who else can I talk to in the industry? Who have you, talk about your experiences? And she gave me Heather Gillette's name, she's a 5-star rider. She's white, but is a huge ally of Black people. And she, had an amazing interview with her. And I ended up writing an article called Bringing Everyone into Eventing. We put a Black person on the cover for the first time ever since 1959, when the magazine was started. And because of this article, the DEI committee was started at the USEA. And then Dr. Kerwood and Heather went on to start Strides for Equality Equestrian. So, I mean, which is doing amazing, amazing work. And so it's just crazy to me how one phone call, how one interview could have such a big impact. And not only on me personally, but hopefully on the sport and the industry. So, I mean, it's pretty cool when you just pick up the phone and just do it, what can happen. So
it's pretty impressive too, when you see the resonance within the community for something that personally resonated with you, but then you see the, down road impacts of how much that it impacts the community.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. Carolyn, you've had some things in the horse world that probably you expected, and probably some things that had surprised you. Leslie just talked about how she was surprised how much this had such a huge impact. It was timing, it was the appropriateness of the communication, it was the right time, the right place, the right delivery. Were there things that really surprised you that were hugely successful in the media world after you got started, or just things that surprised you overall, and how the equine world does communications is different than the other world?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think to be honest, what initially surprised me when I was first kind of getting started is how much room for growth there really was in our sport. You know, I think Piper probably had a really similar experience, and maybe Leslie too, but just to, you know, when you're young and you're kind of like acting as a reporter, you kind of sit in on these press conferences over and over, and they feel so repetitive sometimes, and they feel like the same questions are being asked. And, you know, even as a young person, you know, because I'd had some other experiences through internships and just through connections, I think I kind of felt like there's got to be something more here. You know, there's a lot of, I think that it's really great to have these two other women on this conversation with me, because I think that these people are great examples of ways that you can find themes and things that matter in a community that can feel a little bit superficial sometimes. So I think that now we're seeing, I mean, the Plaid horse, you know, doing so much work around, sorry, you can probably hear my toddler right outside my door. Probably, you know, just doing so much work around body image, for instance, and the USCA, you know, really pushing for inclusivity. I think that those are really, really big moments, and those are really excellent examples of how the horse community can contribute to growth in a larger sense. I think that doesn't seem surprising now, but I think when I was first kind of getting into it, I was like, do we just go to press conferences and just ask the same questions over and over? And like, how did your horse feel today? Like, there's just got to be there's so much more to being in this sport than what happens after you get your horse off the trailer at a show. And I think that that's becoming more important and more accepted to talk about. And I think that that's real, to me, that's where we actually move the needle on how we regard one another in this community, how we regard people who are coming into the community. And I think that that does have a runoff effect in terms of if we become a sport that more people, I mean, granted, there's all these financial barriers as well. And I like, there's a lot more to this, but in an ideal world, if we can bring more people into the sport, that's only going to allow for more people to have different varying, you know, perspectives, and for the sport to actually grow, which has, you know, certainly has upsides and downsides, but mostly upsides. So I think when we think about scaling the sport, you know, we have to think about the conversations that we're having within our insular communities and how those would appear to people in the outside world as well. So it's a really roundabout way of saying that I think what has surprised me in a positive and negative sense is, at first I was like, there's got to be more to this. And now I'm finding that there really is more to this.
But I think that's also to the credit of the three of you of pushing that discussion and being successful in the communications to open up those conversations. Because a lot of people can come in and say, okay, well, you know, I'm going to report on this clear round, and that's all the conversation I'm going to have. But having those opportunities and those communication paths where you have those dialogues and you have those tough conversations, or you're ready to tackle it and say, hey, listen, you know, this may not be the right thing, but there's a way that we can tackle this to allow other people to tackle it even more. Whether that's, you know.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot more room for people to say, you know, I don't know if I'm saying this perfectly, and maybe this isn't exactly the right thing to say, or maybe I don't have the answer to this, but I'm going to open up this conversation for people to start to think about. You know, I know that we'll probably talk about podcasts on this webinar, but that for me has been the biggest advantage of having that as a medium, is that you can really be exploratory. And I think that, you know, just getting curious about the people and the issues that make up our sport outside of just who's on the leaderboard, like you have to, because like most of us are not, you know, just doing horses all day. Most of us are amateurs. Most of us have all of these other facets of life. And I think that, I think that that's really important. And I'm so happy. I mean, even, you know, this webinar, I think that this is such a wonderful opportunity to reflect on that a little bit. And these other two women that I'm on with do that so beautifully as well.
Why do you think the podcast, we're going to go a little off the framework here, guys. Why do you think the podcast, I heard this from all three of you, so I'm going to explore it a little bit more. Why do you think the podcasts have been so successful in recent years? I mean, they're a relatively new phenomenon in the industry, but I think you probably all would agree that they're allowing people to have this dialogue. I know there's Leslie, you talked a little bit about the cancel culture on social media that you've had to battle. Why do you think the podcasts have resonated so much with people? Do you think it's because it's a safer space and you aren't going to get immediately attacked?
I mean, it's funny that you say, I mean, the USCA has actually had a podcast since 2012. We released ours. So, I mean, we're going on 10 years of podcasting. And I think we were almost a little bit too early because it didn't catch on. Like our first episodes have like 7 downloads, you know, like it's sad. But I mean, I think podcasts have worked recently because people are consuming information in different ways and they don't have the patience to read long form articles as much as I don't want to judge. I love reading and things, and some people do, so I shouldn't broadly say, but I think, I mean, podcasts are so wonderful when you're driving, when you're riding. I mean, it's just such a good way. I mean, it's almost replaced like talk radio or NPR, you know, those kind of things. I mean, it's just evolving. And it is a really good way to have a real conversation and talk to a variety of people that, you know, might be more open to speak to you in that environment than trying to get their quotes perfect in print. But I will definitely defer to Caroline, who's the podcast expert.
I'm going to pass it to Piper. I mean, Piper is also the podcast expert.
Yeah.
I'm really keen to, I mean, Piper's, you guys have had a podcast for a fair bit of time too. I think a few years. Yeah.
6 years. Yeah.
Wow.
And it's one of the top most listened podcast, I think, around, right?
I think it's an empathy thing. Yeah. And I definitely agree with both of you. I think when you hear someone say that and talk about their struggles, like you cannot help but empathize with them. And to echo what Caroline said, like in the beginning, when I just went to press conferences and like wrote up who won, I found myself very quickly losing empathy. Like I'd be like, you got 4th place, like in the Grand Prix, like you must be terrible, you know? You're like, come on, I'm trying to interview the winner here. And like, it's amazing how quickly you lose perspective and you lose empathy. And then when you go horse show, like, you know how hard it is to get 4th place at anything, you know? And when you go out yourself, you know how hard. Like this sport is so hard at every level. And I think we all want to discount people. My husband always jokes. So he always comes in and says, he's like, now wherever you ride right now is the only acceptable place. People who ride better than you have spent too much money and it's because they have more money than you. People who don't ride as well as you haven't tried hard enough. The only correct place to ride is wherever you are currently at this moment. And it's his joke, but I always like, you start to look around and you're like, oh wait, people actually think this. And I do think it is so easy to lose empathy for each other and our own experiences and our own chance encounters and our own decisions. And, you know, it's just because someone's made a bad decision doesn't mean they don't deserve empathy or made a decision you wouldn't make, or, you know, have maybe put in the same amount of work as you and have more or less success. Like, and I do think podcasts allow us to be human with each other and empathize. And I'm with Leslie, like I still feel all the feels reading long form, but that's not a realistic sell in today's market.
So do you think the podcasts are going to push out the print media for successful communications? Do you think they're just going to supplement each other?
I think so. I mean, I think it is so important to release information in different mediums because you need to talk to every type of person. I mean, that's why it's, you know, when we're getting information out, we send it in a newsletter, we put it on social media, we talk about it in the podcast, we put it in the magazine, we'll send a text message. I mean, everybody consumes in different ways, especially in the horse industry where it's so hard to get in touch with people that are on horseback and aren't sitting in front of their computers, that I think that I personally think print's here to stay. for that group of people. And then their podcast is here for another group, and social media is here for another group, and a video is here for another group. And it's so important to use every means of communication you can.
Yeah. I think just to a little bit chime in on what Piper was saying too. For me, starting Equestrian Voices really came from a place of trying to solve a little bit, or not solve, but allow a little bit of a different avenue for people to sort of think out loud and think in the gray area. Like, I think, to me, one of the reflections that I've had watching conversations unfold politically and within our sport and in all of these other facets on social media, especially in the past 3 to 4 years, is that we have to get away from just talking and thinking about things in purely black and white ways. And because nothing is really that way. And so I think that for me, that is really what piqued my interest in the podcast medium. I think it also, it allows us to bring a little bit of levity to things that don't feel like you can write in that way necessarily. I also think it's a really beautiful way, talking about connecting with some of these athletes emotionally and just acknowledging that even the top riders, they have interests and desires and all of these things outside of just the horses. That's it's a really beautiful avenue to sort of tap in a little bit to the humanity of people. And that is, I think, what really fosters connection. I mean, if you think about, a lot of other sports, you root for teams because you're rooting for the athletes, because there's some sort of like human connection there. I mean, I'm thinking about like golf, for instance. People are became really interested in Tiger Woods' story, for better or worse. But just as an example, that athlete connection is actually like what really changed the trajectory of fandom in that sport and fan participation. And I think that that's something that until, kind of more recently, maybe has not been not done in our sport, because there's tons of amazing journalists that have come before me and before Piper and Leslie that have been doing that in a really beautiful way. But I think that podcasts are a really great medium to connect with people that feel out of touch to you, or that you don't necessarily think that you have an automatic connection to, in a really beautiful way. And then, explore some of those complex topics that we can talk about in more of a gray exploratory sense, instead of just, here's my opinion and it's one-sided. And if you disagree with me, you should hit up the comments.
And it can be taken out of context at any time and quoted inappropriately in another media.
Exactly. Yeah. It definitely breaks down a little bit of that sort of buttoned up public relations type of feeling that sometimes you do get when you're, I don't do this so much anymore, but when you're reporting on sport, it feels very kind of PR, kind of buttoned up, and it's a good way to break down those barriers.
You mentioned the Tiger Woods one. And so that probably is a good segue into, you've got a lot of opportunities in media to have this, community and see behind the scenes and have the discussions, but sometimes things go horribly wrong, and they go horribly wrong in your area, and you're trying to figure out how to do crisis management. You're trying to figure out if you put an article out, if you put a social media post out, if you're supposed to put anything out. Leslie, you mentioned this a little bit earlier about the stuff that was going on in the larger American community and whether or not USEA was supposed to comment or not comment. Talk a little bit, and that's probably a good way to start it. Talk a little bit about how you've used media and what you found is successful when things don't go well, when you don't have the person in front of you that you're happily interviewing or having a conversation and you're just ready to have a glass of wine with, but all of a sudden things got really ugly, or somebody that you're working for said the wrong thing, or you're doing crisis management. All three of you have very different hats that you wear because you've got very different stakeholder communities. I kind of feel like each one of you has your own uphill boulders that you have to roll on different days. Leslie, any thoughts from your end about how you successfully manage some of those comms in a crisis scenario, or when things don't go and people aren't having empathy as much as you would like?
Well, as you mentioned, I mean, I wear a very different hat from Piper and Caroline. I mean, the USEA is, representative of the sport of eventing. So we don't put out our own personal opinions on anything. But as far as crisis management, unfortunately, I have had a lot of experience with that. I mean, the sport of eventing is, we're constantly managing risk. And the number one thing that we focus on is transparency. And I'm really thankful that our CEO, Rob, and the president are right on line with me, and we release whatever information that we can and is appropriate. When we unfortunately have a death, whether it be person or horse, we, the TD calls us and we have the information on our website as soon as possible. It could be one simple line, because that's all the details we have at that moment, but there's no point in waiting. I mean, it's going to get out there and there's going to be bad rumors, and I would rather be the first person that puts out the accurate information, so it could be something very simple, but I put it out and then we can add to it later as more information comes available. But it is something we have a lot of problems with. And so transparency is my first line of defense. And then I don't allow us to get into battles on social media. I will answer questions, but I will not argue. And that is kind of another big point in staying on top of things and not letting things derail. So that is another thing with crisis, is that as hard as it is to sit on your hands, you cannot pick a fight. And you have to stand on your own 2 feet and believe in what you put out, and that people are going to argue amongst themselves and you can't jump in. So I think those are, the biggest takeaways I've learned. And also, I think it's really important to have collaboration. Like in a crisis, I really like to talk to as many people as I can to make sure we're all on the same page. Like, I don't want it to be all on one person's shoulders, whoever's running social media that week or in charge of the website. I mean, we all communicate and we have the same message, because there's nothing worse than pointing fingers behind the scenes and saying, well, I would have done it differently. Right. I think it's really needs to be collaborative, especially with the board and the senior leadership and everything.
Do you find sometimes that the collaboration with outside entities, that there's time for that? Or do you find normally that just making sure the association is internally organized and the comms usually works best?
I would say if it's, just our event or just something that's focused inside, we keep the communication internal, because other entities do have different philosophies than us and might push back. But when it comes down to it, it is our communication we're putting out on our website. We're not posting it on somebody else's website or putting it thing. So they can choose to release information differently. But we do keep the discussions internal. And we do work with the events too, and people. So.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, everyone's looking at everybody's websites, but as consistent and methodical as you can be, usually starts tamping down some of the fires. And if you don't allow yourself to be pulled into the fight, people want to instigate, they want to poke.
For sure. And we do, we put it out on our website, but we won't post it on social media, because people are coming to, social media is a really good tool to deliver information for people that aren't seeking it. They're mindlessly scrolling down their Facebook feed or going through their Insta story, and they might happen to come across it, but they weren't actively looking for that information. So they didn't need to know that. Whereas if they're coming to our website organically, they're seeking out the information. So in a big crisis or something, we're not hiding it by not putting it on social media, but we do just post it on our website. And that helps too with keeping the comment section more manageable.
That if anybody's listening and jotting down notes, that's something that you definitely want to, as a best practice, what Leslie just said, You know, the difference between putting something down that people are passively or if they're actively looking for it. That's definitely something that I've seen, I think, in Piper's correspondence as well. The different modules and the different communication paths and how people are using them. But it's important because in social media, the type of person who's looking for information there, as you point out, Leslie, is very different than the person who's reading the article. I like to read the article. I don't want to read the social media. I want to read the article. You know?
Yeah.
Piper, do you find that works as well for you when you're doing crisis management and battling different things? The similar approach, do you find?
Absolutely. I really have struggled with like wanting everyone to like me and wanting everyone to think I do a good job. And it's been a really hard struggle to come to terms with, like, there are people who relish when I make a mistake, just relish in it. And they are excited and they want to see it and they can't wait to point it out to me. And, you know, and that's been really hard on me. And I make a lot of mistakes. So I get to experience this, you know, frequently. And so I think that, like, really that's been like, but again, that comes back to the coping mechanisms and that's on me and how I handle it and how I react and whose opinion I care about. And, like, you know, it's like coming out of the show ring and your trainer being like, well, you chipped at fence too. Like, yeah, I'm aware.
Like, I'm not in the horse. I do know I tipped a fence too.
Yeah. And to me, like, that's almost like a waste of your precious time with your trainer for them to say stuff like that to you. It's like, let's talk about, like, what turn we cut and, like, what, you know, policies and protocols are in place so that this error doesn't happen again, and really making that a constructive conversation. And then I think there is so much stuff every day that it's like, should we talk about it? Should we not talk about it? Part of my thing is empathy and compassion, which means I also have empathy and compassion for everyone, which is judges and horse show managers and all of, you know, given that I try to think about things from everyone's perspective, like, you know, I really do try to go through, like, what is constructive. And I have people that are extremely angry at me pretty much all the time because they'll say, like, people didn't need to know that. And, like, there's a lot of stuff we don't report on, but there's stuff, you know, that is not, you know, that I do think is constructive to have the conversation. And so, you know, it kind of goes all ways. And, like, indoors last year for the equitation was very dramatic, a few horse shows in a row. And, you know, I got a lot of kickback from, you know, these are like, you know, at what point is this a private problem or a public problem? And I think, like, you know, that's a little bit what Leslie addressed is, like, you know, private problems go on the website and public problems go on social media at some level. And, you know, do we handle this in sport in-house, or do we need the urging of the public? And I'm the first one to email in all the time to Youssef and be like, what are you doing about this? If you are doing something, I will not call attention to it. And if you're not doing something, I'm going to say, like, let's call attention to this, because, like, this is something that action needs to happen. But a lot of times, if they're already investigating and they're already pushing forward, I don't think letting people get dramatic on Facebook comments helps a sport or makes a sport look good or, you know, moves things forward. So I think it's often a lot of dialogue with people of, like, is this something that you are actively putting in the effort to change versus is this something you're trying to ignore? You know, and I think all of that's really, really related, because if U.S. Equestrian is trying to fix something, I'm really always inclined to give them a wide berth and say, please go fix that. You know, I would rather it be fixed than report about it. But if it's something that various people are ignoring for other reasons, you know, one of them last fall was that they introduced instant replay into the equitation ring, which is not in the rule book. And, you know, when asked, they didn't have a good answer. And I was like, yeah, of course we're going to talk about this because this is a game changer.
So it sounds like one of the techniques might be to say, hey, listen, all these people are talking about this. I'm going to go to the people who are supposed to have an answer and see if they have an answer. And if they don't have an answer, maybe I'll have the conversation to create an answer. And if they have an answer, then it's not, I don't need necessarily to facilitate that conversation. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I mean, we for sure, if there can be positive steps or positive resolution even without discussing it, I do think that the public does not need to be in on every discussion. I do think that the governing bodies put in so much work. I do think they're all legitimately trying to make so many aspects of the sport better. I do think they have to prioritize, and I do think the public helps them prioritize sometimes when they might not want to push something to the front. And I think, this is where we all, with George Floyd, like got said, the public said, like, you're not prioritizing this enough, and media and governing bodies and everyone sat up and said, you're right, and that was positive pressure to, make our sport better and move different things further ahead in the line. And so, that's like, but like people start conversations with me like, oh, I know you hate USEF. And I was like, no, not at all. I think they do so much like great work for our sport.
You all have a lot of the educational aspects. And so a lot of what we've been talking about is a little bit of policy, like something's gone wrong. What's your policy on it? What's your position on it? How do you respond to this? But there's been a lot of work in the educational aspect of, maybe this trainer's methods were inappropriate or there was a scandal about it. And Carolyn, you've got a lot of videos that basically have the educational master classes. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been using those videos to communicate, to bring the community together? It's a very different medium, obviously, than the podcast and the writing, but it's, I think, your flagship product. You're very well known for it. It's hugely popular, but there's sometimes when potentially things don't go perfectly well and you have to manage them as well. Can you talk a little bit about that with the audience?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, when you are thinking about having an educational product as a brand, because we didn't start as an educational product, but it's more, it was an editorial platform first. We had the magazine, which I ran for a few years, and then we sort of shifted into Equestrian Masterclass. There was always an educational theme sort of throughout, but I think that to have an educational product, and I'm actually really keen to hear Piper's take on this too, because she's so involved in the education world in sort of a different way. I think that trustworthiness is very, very, very important. And I think just like when you're like in school, when you're a kid, it's difficult to learn from people that you don't really trust. We sort of have the same philosophy and the same approach with Equestrian Masterclass. So, things are going to happen. And like Leslie and Piper say, sometimes it's a mistake that you've made as a company or as a person that works for that company. And sometimes it's a situation that's completely out of your control. But I think it's always a really good first step. If, for instance, like if you have someone that you feel like is maybe pushing the boundaries, you're filming and somebody's pushing the boundaries of like, this doesn't actually like really align with our sort of values as a company and horse people. And, there's all sorts of issues that have come up over the past few years, like even about, turning out your horses and like whether that's a thing that you can do or not. I think that that's a conversation that you always have to take back to your team. I think Leslie mentioned that, like just talking to as many other people that are also, have the audiences, not just the companies, but the audience's best interest in mind, and just saying, is this a person that, aligns with us? And like, not everybody does. And that's okay. That's totally fine. That's what makes the world go round. However, I think that understanding where your lines are as a company. I mean, I work with a very small team. Like there's only 5 of us, which always is surprising to people. But I think that, I think that makes it easier in a lot of ways, because we all see really, really eye to eye on that sort of thing. So if there's something that somebody does that's out of our control and we just receive that kind of information, it's pretty fast for us all to do a gut check and say, how does this sit with you? And ultimately, you know, I'm in a different position than say Leslie, who, you know, the USEA has a totally different role. For Noelle, Floyd, we are an editorial platform first and an educational platform second. And I think that, and I don't mean that that's how we have evolved as a product, not that that's our priorities now, but we have a different set of stakeholders and interests than say like the USEA. So it's really easy for us to just do a gut check and say, this doesn't feel good to us. We're going to take the product down, or tell our customers why we're taking it down, or, you know, however that kind of sits right for us. Cause we're just such a small team. It's pretty easy for us to be agile in that kind of way.
Yeah. And you've got the ability to have the transparency in a way that you're comfortable, you know, which Leslie was talking about as well. And
yeah, for sure. Like that trustworthiness, I think is really, really, it doesn't, you know, kind of what Piper's saying too, it doesn't do anyone any good to be sort of, you know, like smoke and mirrors about anything. And I think everyone has a different threshold for that. And everyone has a different approach for that. And like, it, you know, there are some people that are going to disagree with the company's decisions and the things that, you know, you do. And I think that just understanding that not everyone, it's like, it's tale as old as time, right? Like not everybody's going to agree with everything you do. But I think at the end of the day, we are all in this because we have pretty strong morals and values as they relate to horses, because we really just are in this because we all love horses and love the sport. So I think that asking some of those harder questions, even if they're really, really uncomfortable, it only pushes the sport forward.
Yeah. And also you're dealing with an audience of stakeholders that inherently have stronger opinions than your average human being, because anybody who works with horses is going to have an opinion about something. You know, they're not going to be wallflowers. You can't work with horses and have wallflowers. So you're predisposed to an audience of stakeholders that are going to criticize and are going to give you feedback and are going to have reactions much more than your normal, you know, quilting operations potentially. And that's part of the audience and the stakeholders, unfortunately. You know, it's both a blessing and a curse, because they're going to be involved and they're going to communicate with you, but they're going to be involved and they're going to communicate with you.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm curious, as we transition over to the Q&A stuff, where you all think the community and the industry needs to go, and where there's still some openings of where you can be pushing the community, either with the communications, with the media, opportunities with the video, the photography. Piper, I see you nodding your head, so we'll let you kick off there about a little bit where you think you can take it with the equine media.
I think we're at a pivot point where we all need to kind of upgrade again and try some new things. I think we've all gotten very good and comfortable at what we're doing, which is, you know, not something that we've always had a ton of time to do in the last 10 years, as, you know, Facebook, Instagram, podcast, you know, all these things came out kind of, you know, sequentially. And I don't think, you know, anyone ever really had time to get comfortable. I think we've actually had a little bit of time to get comfortable and good at stuff right now. But I also think it means that it's going to be time to do something new again. And I'm actually not entirely sure what that is. Like, that's part of what I've been like keeping my eyes open for, because I do think it's going to be time to come up with a new, you know, something that, you know, breaks form a little bit. And I don't know what that is, but I think all three of us will know what that is in the next 12 months.
I mean, one thing I always push people who work for me and or with this is just never be happy with the status quo. I mean, once you get doing the same thing 3 years in a row, it is so old. But it's so hard to change and to do things differently and have people accept it, because they're like, oh, but last year you released this beautiful roster, why didn't you do it this year? I'm like, because I don't want to do it the same thing again. Like, but then, you know, like my team, like we're having discussion around Kentucky coming up in a few weeks, and we always release a roster with little facts about the riders and we've done it for 3 years. And it's like, I'm like, okay, let's do something new this year. Let's not do it, the roster again. We're done with it. But then what do you do that's new and different? Like, how do you fill that gap? Like, it is so hard to be on the cutting edge. And that's why it's called the cutting edge, because, you know, whoever's first, everyone's going to follow. But like, how do you be first? And so I think that's something with Equine Media, is we need to try to be first instead of just following the other media industries. But I don't know what the answer is to that.
I think someone asked me this question the other day, actually, and it really kind of made me reflect on my own personal view on this. And their question was, you know, like, who else do you like to sort of follow in the equestrian space and like pay attention to how they're doing things? And I said, like, kind of nobody, because I think that for me, I'm constantly looking like outside of the equestrian bubble for inspiration. And that is absolutely not to say that there are not amazing people doing kick-ass things in the equestrian space. Like, that's not to discredit anything, but I think that when it's being done in the equestrian space already, they don't need me to do it again. Like, so I think that constantly just sort of looking outside at, like, just, and not searching, but just genuinely asking yourself, like, what inspires you? You know, getting back to, again, that point that I made earlier about there's so much more to all of us than what we talk about at the barn, and like just the parts of us that have to do with horses. And I think that tapping into what we're really, really interested in, and what makes us feel scared, what makes us feel upset, what makes us feel excited, inspired, all of those things that have nothing to do with horses. I think that those are lessons that we can almost tap into within ourselves a bit more when we're thinking about how to shape communication in the equestrian industry as well.
Because connecting to those other facets of people that aren't necessarily only in the channel of horses is going to be a way to tap into more of those thoughts and emotions.
Yeah. And I think that that's how, you know, people historically have come up with brilliant ideas for, you know, the companies that now are like household names. So yeah, that to me is, I just wanted to chime in with that as well, because I think that we're such a bubble sometimes. So it's really, really good to just be constantly thinking, like, what do I really love that's outside of this bubble?
I think a lot about clothing designers and how they can come up with new t-shirts and new sweaters each year. And I'm like, how did you come up with that when it's a t-shirt? But each year they come up with these new ideas that have nothing to do with a t-shirt I've ever seen before. And it's walking on the fashion show, and it's this incredible t-shirt. And I can only imagine the amount of different outside creativity ideas you have to bring into an area that's like, okay, we have been interviewing who won the Grand Prix for the last 27 years. So how do we make it interesting? How do we bring folks in? Well, I would love to continue this dialogue for another 2 hours. However, we do have a slew of Q&A that has come in. So I'm going to transition over to Natasha Springers-Levine, our Chief Operating Officer at Strider. Those of you who are on the panel since the start, feel free to chat in the, and even if you haven't been on from the start, feel free to chat your questions over to Natasha. We've had a slew that's come in already for the panelists, so thank you so much. We'll transition over to the live Q&A right now.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you guys, panelists, so much for the amazing discussion and conversation. There have been a couple of questions that came in. There were a few, I'm going to kind of like push them together and kind of see where that takes us. There were a few questions about photography, copyright, and sort of the visual component of communications. We talked so much about words and how much they matter and the mediums through which they come across. So I'm wondering if you guys can sort of discuss a little bit of visuals and how they matter. And also, I know that in our pre-discussions, we talked a little bit about copyright. So if one of you kind of wants to take that to bat and hit it home, then please go right ahead. And Leslie, I see you kind of starting. So go ahead and take that one.
Well, I just want to say, I think with photography and visuals, the most important thing to do is to pay attention to details. Some of the biggest trouble we've run into are the flash is too tight, the bit is too big, this is inappropriate, the rider's, hands are in the wrong place. And when in doubt, leave it out, just not talking about jumping, but, for leaving out a photo that you aren't sure if it's right. So I think that's so important, is you might think it's the most beautiful picture, and then you zoom in and, the horse's tongue is hanging out the side inappropriately. So I think that's one thing with photographers submitting images or choosing images, is to look at the details, even if it's the most beautiful picture in the world. So as far as copyright, just ask, it can never hurt to ask the photographer if you have permission to use it, so I think that is super important. I have great relationships with photographers and just shoot them text messages like, am I allowed to use this picture that the rider submitted? It's just easier that way to ask.
Yeah, there was actually a specific question, so maybe Piper or Caroline, you guys can take this one, but what would be a good tip for a photographer who maybe submits it to a couple of different places? Like, do you guys see that, where maybe you receive a submission from a photographer and then you find out that maybe they've also submitted it elsewhere? Like, what is the best practice for them in terms of getting their work out there without sort of overselling it or putting it in, diluting the relationship a little bit?
I think it's just a matter of being upfront. Like, I don't necessarily think that we wouldn't, buy or use a photo because, we knew someone else had it. But like, we would like to know, and like we had a instance with a video a couple of years ago where we paid for, them to go and shoot the video. And then we found out later that they gave the video to other publications and it was on, all this stuff. And obviously that wasn't, what the contract or the agreement said, and I think it's just about being upfront with that stuff. And I think a lot of, there are a lot of publications that it's not really their wheelhouse, but we don't do a ton of eventing coverage, but like if someone, comes to us and says like, I want to shoot for this event or do a gallery on your website or, whatever. And like, would you mind if those pictures went somewhere else? Like that, I wouldn't have an issue with something like that because people aren't coming to us for eventing coverage per se. And I view it as more of an added bonus to our content. But I think just communication is never wrong. Having written adult communication by email, and having, that there to reference if there's confusion, like all issues we have with other people, right, are of failing to meet expectations at some level. Like someone has an expectation that's not met, and that's where all conflict is born, right? So
write that on, like, etch that into some marble or something, because yeah.
So the more you could just say like keep the expectations where they actually are. I know
Leslie talked a little bit about this, but the transparency, and both of you hit on this in the crisis management. So I think just again, it sort of brings it all home, like that transparency and open lines of communication is really important.
Yeah, the 2016 Olympics, we bought a photo for our cover that ran on another cover the week before that came out, and it was devastating to me. And if the photographer had just told me, oh, I sold this picture to somebody else, I would have had the opportunity to switch out the photo. But they never told me, and I didn't think to ask, and now I've learned my lesson. But as a professional photographer, don't do that to somebody. Just that one.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add to that. I think all of those are really good points. I think, definitely people make mistakes, own them. Like I have definitely gotten the photo credit wrong on an article before, or not, not put it, you thought that we owned a photo and we didn't. And you just try to right those instances as soon as possible. I think for just best practices, if like you're a young photographer and you're not sure, if you are being paid for and sent, or a videographer, by the company or by the publication to go and, shoot something, a specific assignment, a lifestyle shoot, something like that, you can safely assume and then always clarify that you are shooting it for just that publication. And you should not be sending those photos anywhere else. Everyone has different levels of comfort in terms of you as a photographer or videographer using that photo on like your personal social media to say like, hey, I got this photo published and in the Plaid horse, or whatever, because we also understand that you're trying to build a business and you're trying to build a career and a bit of a portfolio. So most editors will say, that's okay once, or share it from our social media instead of just posting it to your Instagram, that kind of thing, or say shot for Noelle Floyd, something like that. I think that it's a tough gig. Like, I think that, Leslie and Piper would probably agree that, it's important that horse show photographers do well and can make a viable career and a viable living. And so I think understanding that, like, all of us have made mistakes. I'm sure all three of us have, but we're typically on the same team as photographers. I think sometimes it can feel a little bit adversarial, and it doesn't have to. It does feel really adversarial when people are just blatantly stealing your photos or stealing your articles or whatever. Like, that does feel adversarial, but sometimes it's just, again, it just gets back to the communication piece that Piper so beautifully stated. That should be a disclaimer anytime you go to anybody's website.
Absolutely. So there was one, I think we have time for one more question, and there was a really great one that came in, along with some thanks for doing the webinar, which is always really nice to hear. But this person asked, how do you three, so Piper, Leslie, and Caroline, like to get support and engagement from riders and participants in the equestrian community? So Piper, maybe you want to kick that one off, and then
I think reading, sharing, subscribing, listening, any of that stuff. I cannot tell you what, like, as a small business, what an actual like subscription does mean. Like, we notice and we are excited, and that's what, and on the flip side, when someone complains about our content, the first thing I do is look and see if they subscribe, and and if they don't, I'm like, you really, like, you get a lot of great stuff for free on social media, but you really don't get a voice in this process. And so I think that, like, all of that stuff is great. And really let us know what you connect with. Let us know what you like. We all want to make more content. All three of us want to make more content that you like and that you want to consume and that you appreciate and that you think is good. And, let us know stuff you like, let us know stuff you don't like. And I think the best way to support us is to just be along on this journey with us.
Yeah, that's awesome. Leslie, do you have anything to add
also
there?
Like, don't underestimate just how, especially for freelance writers or freelance photographers, or these contractors that we'll work with sometimes, it means the world to us as well. It means so much when people give positive feedback. I think people underestimate, like, when I get a DM on Instagram or whatever from somebody saying, hey, I like listened to this podcast and it did XYZ for me, it literally makes my day. Like, it makes all of the work that we do so much more worth it. It makes us want to like push ourselves, and not that that's anybody else's responsibility to like pat us on the back, but I think that we do underestimate, and I do this all the time, with even like other podcasts that I listen to outside of the horse space. I'll think, gosh, that was so good, and then I won't say anything, and I think that it's really important to just be a little bit encouraging and, understanding that really does go a long way. And it also helps kind of guide the compass in terms of what kinds of conversations we're having in the space.
Yeah. I know it's the same thing as like, if you're at a horse show or you're somewhere with your horse and someone like compliments that your ear bonnet and your show jacket match, you're like, thank you.
Like, yeah, like I spent hours looking for this ear bonnet. Yeah.
Not to minimize what you guys are doing, but it really, like, a little bit of positivity goes such a long way. And I think that's kind of what you were just hitting home as well. Leslie, did you have anything to add? Sorry about my little.
No, I mean, I definitely agree with what Piper and Caroline said. I mean, they hit the nail on the head. I just think that the best way to support us is to consume. I mean, unfortunately, I get told probably every single day, well, you didn't tell me that. I'm like, okay, I did tell you that, but this is a two-way street. And unfortunately, you need to take the information in too. Like, I can't use ESP to get it to you. And I don't want to be harsh, but it is definitely my biggest struggle as, the director of communications, is getting people to accept the communication. So, I mean, that it would be my biggest support, would be just take it in and understand it.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And ask questions, because they're probably going to get an answer.
Yeah, for sure.
Leslie, I would say thank you for adding that to the end. We didn't have a chance to explore it as fully as I would have liked through the panel discussion, but that personal accountability in reading, considering, thinking about it, absorbing it before a knee-jerk response is everyone's responsibility, and that is one of the best ways you can support the professionals in the community, is just being accountable for your reaction to what you're reading and absorbing and how you best read and absorb. I know at a certain time of day, I'm going to have a knee-jerk reaction to whatever somebody says to me about a certain topic. So sometimes I have to put myself in a timeout, because that's not the right time for me to be talking about that particular issue. I just need to go have a timeout. And then 2 hours later, I can come back and I can have that discussion. If you catch me at the wrong time and the wrong day, yeah, I'm just not the person you want to have a conversation with. So,
we always joke. I didn't the comment on Facebook. I didn't read it, but I hate it.
Well, Piper, Carolyn, Leslie, thank you very much for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts, your insights, your wisdom, your perspectives, your stories, your experiences. I know I speak for everybody on this webinar that we very much appreciate hearing it. We could all sit here probably for another 2 hours and not have dinner, but I think you all probably want to go home and have dinner. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Everyone who attended and shared, thank you for attending and supporting tonight's webinar. It will be sent out via recording in the next day or two, along with some additional information on how to get in contact and follow Leslie, Piper, and Caroline, and stay engaged with their communities and their correspondence, whether that is through Noelle Floyd, the Plaid Horse, becoming a member of the USEA, or going to the website of USEA, whatever it is. We'll make sure you all have those capabilities to stay in touch with them. Please do feel free to reach out to them directly for professional dialogue as appropriate. And thank you all for joining us this evening.